Extremely excited to introduce our keynote speaker today, Professor Archer. I had the opportunity to hear Professor Archer speak a year ago during my first year of law school. Professor Archer was a visiting speaker in a first-year elective where students were introduced to cutting-edge legal research on the relationship between law and inequality. And I so vividly remember leaving that class feeling energized, ready to share all that I had learned with my community, and ready to explore these issues further. I know I personally have been looking forward to this moment, and I am sure all of our audience members have as well. So without further ado, I am excited to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Archer.
Thank you. Thank you for the very generous introduction, Carla, and for the invitation to join you all today. I'm really excited to be here to join the incredible conversations around mobility and transportation justice. It's Black History Month, so I want to start off with words from Dr. King. Dr. King often spoke about the beloved community. He said the aftermath of nonviolence is the creation of the beloved community. So when the battle is over, a new relationship comes into being between the oppressed and the oppressor. And the beloved community was Dr. King's vision for a truly integrated America, where every person in every community had access to social and economic opportunity. No separate and unequal, but a society where everyone could live lives of joy and dignity, where everyone was invested in the well-being and dignity of their fellow human beings. And Dr. King believed that in the beloved community, we would experience true justice and equality. Opportunity wouldn't be parceled out to privileged individuals or groups, but instead would really be the birthright of everyone. And in many ways, American history is the history of American opposition to that ideal. And more than 60 years later, America remains profoundly segregated along racial lines. We live separately, we learn separately, and we socialize separately. And the systems that this country has so effectively built to protect the privileges and prerogatives of those with power to maintain segregated communities and prevent the birth of the beloved community have a tremendous negative impact on those who are excluded, because you cannot separate the places people have access to from the opportunities that people have access to. Our homes, not only our physical residence, but also the community in which it's located, impacts our lives in numerous and interdependent ways. There really is nothing that place does not touch. Our access to education and jobs, our physical safety and our health, our access to healthy food, our social networks, even the quality of the air we breathe are all deeply impacted by where we live. And in so many ways, the history of Black people in America and a history of other people of color in America is a history not only of control, but of exclusion. And legal and social limitations on how and where people of color live are central to that history. I became a civil rights lawyer because I wanted to fight for the right of people like me and families like mine to live without discrimination and to live with dignity and respect. I grew up in Connecticut in the 70s and 80s as the child of Jamaican immigrants who worked hard, yet struggled every day to provide for our family. And when I was a child, my parents moved from Hartford, Connecticut to a working class Hartford suburb. They wanted to give us a chance for a better life, to live in a safer neighborhood and to attend better schools. And when we moved, we were only one of 3 Black families in the neighborhood. And we clearly weren't wanted. And our neighbors took every opportunity that they could to let us know that. And I remembered the day that we woke up to find that our house had been vandalized and KKK had been painted on our house and our car. And I was so young, just 9 or 10 years old. And at that point, my parents had to explain to me and my brother who the KKK was and why some of our neighbors didn't want us there. And I was terrified to be in our home, to play in our yard, to walk in those streets, even afraid to go to school. And I've since learned that America is fundamentally an idea, a set of principles and demands. The story of America is at its heart a story about the fight to protect and implement those principles and demands. Who gets to feel like they belong? Who gets to benefit from the unprecedented wealth of this nation? Who has access to the opportunities, the potential that being in America offers? Who gets to receive the equal protection of our laws, and who gets to live with safety and dignity? When I think back to my experience growing up in Connecticut, I wonder I'm sorry, I have a note. I'm supposed to pause so that they can announce the CLE code.
Hi, I'm so sorry about that. I just wanted to briefly announce the CLE code. So if you are seeking CLE credit for today's event, please note that CLE passwords will be announced twice during this speech. Write down these passwords and enter them on your digital evaluation form once the event is over. The evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credits. The link to the digital evaluation form was emailed to you in your confirmation email. But if you did not receive the email, if you are on the webinar, please find the link to the evaluation form in the chat. These passwords will tell us how long you have attended. So I will now announce the first of two passcodes. The first password is street, STREET. The first password is street, STREET. Thank you.
Great. So I was saying, when I think back to my experience growing up in Connecticut, I wonder why my parents had to move from a predominantly Black neighborhood to a predominantly white neighborhood in order for us to have a quality education, and to leave a neighborhood that we loved and that loved us in order to access opportunity. Why was living in a white neighborhood considered safer and better, even though we always felt like targets? It's bad enough that my neighbors tried to push us out, but why did we have to go there in the first place? We often talk about so-called good neighborhoods and bad neighborhoods, but let us never forget that we create those neighborhoods. We define what is good and what is bad, and we create those conditions. And the boundaries between those neighborhoods aren't ordained by nature. Public policies and choices create those communities, often through the barriers, roadblocks, and hurdles we put in the way. For my family and so many others, there were economic and social barriers. As Jamaican immigrants who didn't have the opportunity to go to college, my parents faced discrimination and economic challenges that limited where they could live. And even when you have the financial resources to live where you want, public policies and private actions create powerful barriers between communities. And that's how we normally think about segregation. They won't sell us the house, or you've been redlined out of a mortgage. And that is all real and powerful. But sometimes the most powerful and persistent barriers separating communities are physical. And one often overlooked and powerful tool of racial segregation is transportation infrastructure and policy. America's transportation infrastructure is a fundamental part of the racial architecture of our country, with barriers that are both visible and invisible. Transportation infrastructure has been integral in creating and solidifying our racially segregated landscape, serving as walls and wedges and extractors in communities of color around the country. Indeed, among the most prominent state-sponsored racial dividers separating white communities from communities of color and communities of opportunity from communities of exclusion are the physical barriers that America has built, often with the express intent of enforcing racial lines. They are everywhere, yet we really barely notice them and their profound impact. And although many communities were harmed by transportation infrastructure and have stories to tell about the resulting devastation, today I'm going to talk about the experience of some predominantly Black communities. The historical relationship between Black people and transportation, the intentional racial discrimination at the heart of transportation infrastructure development in Black communities, the layering of the devastating impact of the transportation infrastructure over decades of discriminatory housing laws, policies, and practices, and the stark racial divides that persist today make the link between transportation infrastructure and Black communities and Black people unique. Transportation infrastructure is a part of the infrastructure of white supremacy. It has controlled where Black people lived, what was taken from us, how we were valued, the places we had access to, the wealth we could accumulate, and the opportunities that we had access to. And from the building and funding of highways to roads to bridges, sidewalks and public transit, transportation policy and our nation's transportation infrastructure was built at the expense of Black communities and contributed to the underdevelopment of Black America, and it really still does. One result is a man-made physical landscape, and then transportation policies layered over that landscape that make many Black communities inhospitable for success and economic opportunity. The physical barriers and boundaries that are created by this infrastructure do more than simply reflect the existing racial and economic divisions in our society. They often created or reinforced those divisions, reflecting the marriage of decades of racially discriminatory housing policies and the power of transportation to not only connect, but also to divide, exclude, and destroy. And really, so much of this was intentional. A post-Jim Crow response to the fall of traditional tools of racial segregation and the culmination of federal and state laws that mandated segregation. A key example is our nation's interstate highway system. Construction of the interstate highway system played a key role in creating the spatial and economic conditions prevalent in urban centers today, conditions that influence interracial interactions, economic mobility, and community stability. Indeed, highway construction, both symbolically and physically, encouraged racial segregation and isolation. The passage of the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 facilitated this destruction. Federal and state highway builders purposely targeted Black communities to make way for massive highway projects. And in states around the country, highways disproportionately displaced and destroyed Black homes, churches, schools, and businesses, sometimes leveling entire communities. And although it was billed as an opportunity to remove blight, highways often tore through vibrant communities, ripping apart the social fabric of those communities and inflicting economic and psychological wounds on both those forced to leave their homes and on those left behind. So first, I think the highways were a tool of removal. And in states around the country, highway construction displaced Black households and cut the heart and soul out of thriving Black communities as homes, churches, schools, and businesses were destroyed. And in some communities, the highways became the tool that white government officials had been looking for years. The destruction of a Black community to make way for I-95 in the Overtown section of Miami, Florida, provides an example of how construction of the interstate highway system was often used to actualize a racial agenda, to destroy vibrant and economically self-sufficient Black communities. So I-95 tore through the center of Overtown, which was a large Black community that was considered to be the center of economic and cultural life for Black people living in Miami. And as I mentioned, the destruction of Overtown was the realization of a decades-long campaign by white business leaders to remove Black residents and then to claim that land to expand Miami's central business district. And by the late 1960s, Overtown was dominated by the highway, and there was no evidence of all of why it was once called the Harlem of the South. Really, if we look at reports from those days, no corner of Overtown was saved. They demolished homes, churches, apartment buildings, and businesses. And although nearly 40,000 Black people lived in Overtown before the highway expansion, only about 8,000 remained in a hollowed out community after the highway was built. Similarly, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a Black community known as the Hill District was devastated in order to build Interstate 579. And when I-579 opened to traffic, it had effectively cut off the Hill District from Pittsburgh's thriving downtown area, and again, displaced thousands of Black residents. The population of the Hill District dropped from about 54,000 in 1950 to approximately 9,500 in 2013. And more than 400 businesses were lost. And you cannot understate the economic impact, the long-term economic impact that that's had. The community was essentially dammed, and today about 40% of the Hill District's residents live below the poverty line. Some people who could not or did not want to move remained in those hollowed out communities adjacent to the highways, trying to rebuild. And those communities and their residents also bear the marks of decades of accumulated disadvantage. Importantly, highway building gutted the economic core of these communities and killed off a generation of businesses. The elimination of Black-owned businesses through displacement deeply impacted segregated communities that were already deprived for economic investment. Ownership of homes and businesses is really critical in building generational wealth, and highway projects rob Black people of those resources and opportunities. Second, the highways were a tool of segregation. Instead of going through Black communities, some interstate highways encircle them to contain and confine Black residents. So the highway was a tool of a segregationist agenda, erecting a post-Jim Crow wall that separated white and Black communities, protected white people from Black migration, and further entrenched racial segregation. And the highway builders were assisted by existing racial segregation patterns, assisted by redlining, which devalued Black communities, and the racial zoning laws that were rampant. Highway builders were able to build highways on these previously formal or informal boundary lines between white and Black neighborhoods, and at the same time skirt constitutional prohibitions on racial zoning. And this again was often accomplished at the explicit request of white residents who feared integration and Black migration. In Orlando, Florida, at the assistance of white residents, I-4 was built to provide a barrier separating Black residents on the west side of town from white residents and the central business district on the east side. And then finally, the construction of the highways upended Black communities by dividing them up and just breaking apart the sense of community and destroying the social connections that make cities and communities thrive. In Nashville, I-40 was built right through the main Black business district, which had been home to 128 Black-owned businesses. In addition to destroying most of the businesses, 6 Black churches were destroyed and 50 local streets were dead-ended. I-40 also separated many children from their playgrounds and their schools. It separated parishioners from their churches and patients from the hospital in that community. Fisk University, Meharry Medical College, and Tennessee State University, which are 3 historically Black colleges and universities, were walled off from each other and also from the community the schools served. And the highway physically constrained the future growth of the 3 institutions. And these examples, unfortunately, are just the tip of the iceberg. Virtually every state has a story or many stories about a highway destroying a Black community or other community of color. And this construction, of course, had lasting impacts. While the highways connected white people living in suburbia with economic opportunities in the city, Black residents were excluded from white neighborhoods. And when the highway destroyed their homes, they were forced to find new housing in communities that were already intensely segregated by race and class, further entrenching racial segregation and further taxing inadequate housing, employment opportunities, and public services. And those residents and those communities bear the marks of decades of accumulated disadvantage, racial segregation, concentrated poverty, and economic isolation. And of course, the interstate highway system did not cause every problem that urban communities face. However, its construction, the way it was constructed, compounded discrimination, exclusion, and exploitation, and created barriers, physical, economic, and psychological. And these boundaries have withstood the adoption and evolution of civil rights laws. So rather than be forced to comply with the law, as we were seeing segregation laws fall and new civil rights laws emerging, the highways became the law. And in fact, part of the perceived genius in utilizing highways and roads to cement racial inequality was the belief that the exclusionary impact would outlast then current laws that facilitated racial exclusion and skirt future laws that might facilitate or mandate racial inclusion. The law has always been a powerful tool to both subjugate and liberate, and the law's role in transportation infrastructure development really was no different. So how do we move forward? Today, the interstate highway system is on the verge of transformational change as aging highways around the country are crumbling or insufficient to meet growing demand and have to be rebuilt, replaced, or reimagined. And what we do to rebuild America's infrastructure will shape our future for decades to come, just like the original building of the highways shaped our communities and our reality for decades. But weaving cities back together, rebuilding them, revitalizing them, reconnecting them, and redressing the harm of highway development is really not going to be an easy task. The possibility of significant infrastructure development offers an opportunity to redress and repair some of the harm that was caused by the original building of the interstate highway system, also to strengthen those impacted communities and to advance racial equity and economic opportunity moving forward. In fact, as I'm sure we all know, the Biden administration has promised that this will be a central goal, that racial justice, racial equity will be a central goal as we move forward. And the current focus on racial equity certainly holds promise. But the statement of a goal alone does not mean we will advance racial equity in reality. This moment brings risks just as surely as it brings opportunity. There is a risk that federal, state, and local highway builders will repeat the sins of the past at the expense of communities of color whose homes, businesses, and community institutions again stand in the path of bulldozers. In fact, my clinic students and I are working with a community in South Carolina where it's as if we were back in the 1950s and 60s as they plan to build a road that will go right through the Black community and somehow skirt all of the white businesses that are in that neighborhood. Racism is really still woven deeply into the fabric of American society, and the politics of race, class, and infrastructure development remain deeply intertwined. The officials who built the interstate highway system in the 1950s and 1960s were often motivated explicitly by racism and placed little value on Black communities. And this racism persists, of course, and Black lives and Black homes continue to be valued less than others. The question is, how do we address the lingering impact of transportation racism? How do we invest in communities in a way that ensures that all people are able to participate, contribute, and thrive? Historically, urban planners and government officials have not demonstrated sensitivity to these concerns, and they don't have a great track record of integrating concepts of racial justice and racial equity into their work. And as many scholars have noted, where transportation policy has been constructed to limit the opportunity and development of Black people and Black communities, planning professionals have provided the rationale, the data, and the plan of action, rather than embracing the potential to improve the quality of life in Black communities or putting equity at the forefront of siting and infrastructure development projects. Planners have regularly given in to the forces of racism, classism, and tradition. Race continues to be a powerful and frequently used tool to sort physical space, to guide public policy, and to distribute public benefits and burdens. But instead, racial equity, focusing on repairing racialized harm and advancing racial justice in both process and outcome, really has to be a central calculus at each and every stage. And this, of course, will not be easy. A shift in national transportation policy, including reimagining how we use transportation and infrastructure to serve and support communities of color, is a critical first step. But alone, it's not sufficient. To truly transform the relationship between transportation and inequality, we need to do more than just recognize the link between transportation policy, segregation, and exclusion. We need to break that link. Social justice advocates have a lot of responsibility. We have to think about how to harness the power of civil rights laws to dismantle systems and structures of racial inequality and the discrimination at the intersection of race, class, and place that we see in transportation policy. And of course, everyone here knows that the road forward isn't simple, but we have a window of opportunity now, a small window of opportunity to demand better, to stand up, and to do better, and to move us closer to the beloved community that I spoke about at the beginning of my talk. The conversations we are having today and around the country are a powerful start, and I really do appreciate this opportunity to contribute. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Archer, for such a moving and insightful speech. I know that I personally have taken away so much from all that you have shared, and I'm certain that our audience members will go away from this with so much more gained knowledge. Before I close out, I have one more housekeeping item. I will announce the second and final passcode. Again, I will announce the second and final passcode. If you are seeking CLE credit for today's event, the second password is CAR, C-A-R. The second password is CAR, C-A-R. So again, I want to thank Professor Archer for joining us and spending time with us today and providing so much insightful knowledge. We are deeply grateful for her for taking time, and we are also grateful for our audience members for joining us and sticking with us throughout our symposium. We will begin the next panel, which is titled The Pretextual Traffic Stop, How Policing Drivers Fuels Mass Incarceration at 1:15. So I hope that everyone is able to stay tuned. Thank you.